czas zaczynać chyba. Zapraszam wszystkich do zajmowania miejsc. Piętnastego lipca myślę, że czas zaczynać z dwóch przyczyn. Po pierwsze, że była 11, a po wtóre, że jednak 15 lipca to i tak jest piękne, duże zgromadzenie. Starting with our inaugurational speech of our conference, I must start with an information concerning a change in the program of our session. Right now, I should start by asking Professor Alois Nowak, University of Warsaw Vice Rector for Research and Cooperation, to take the floor with his speech. And I would also thank him for his support to this year's conference. Unfortunately, he is not be able to join us today. Of course, we could think of some diplomatic explanation for his absence, but I think that the best way will be better. So I would like to say the truth, as I think all of us will understand. This morning, Professor Nowak, Vice Rector Nowak, was coming back to Warsaw from a place situated a few hundred kilometers away. And on the way, his car simply stopped working. Once such a breakdown could be repaired even by a village mechanic. But now, as you know all, due to technology development, nothing can be done without a computer. Therefore, right, Rector Nowak is probably talking to a mechanic, and perhaps right in this minute, he is told how much will cost for him, unfortunately. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests and participants of the Warsaw East European Conference, it is already the 10th edition, 10th session of our conference. On behalf of myself and Rector Alois Nowak, I would like to warmly welcome all gathered here, participants, panelists, and listeners of our historical 10th session of the Warsaw East European Conference, entitled this year, Across the Borders. During the last 9 sessions of Warsaw East European Conference, we have the honor of hosting many outstanding scientists and politicians, such as President Lech Wałęsa, President Stanisław Szuszkiewicz, President Waldas Adamkus, Minister Bronisław Geremek, Professor Ellen Carrer-Down-Kos, Professor Richard Pipes, who directly or indirectly contributed to collapse of communism. It should be remembered that the first steps in the history of our conference were made in 2004 during the special Warsaw Convention of the Association for the Studies of Nationalities, which gave birth to the concept of a Warsaw East European Conference. Especially cordially this day, I would like to welcome our very special guests who will open our Jubilee session this year. This is Professor Andrew Michta, who will deliver an inaugural lecture entitled Central and Eastern Europe in US Security Policy. Professor Michta is a lecturer of international studies at Rhodes College and is specializing in problems connected to NATO, transatlantic security system, as well as European foreign and security policy. He is also currently a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. Our guest was also serving with his knowledge and experience in numerous think tanks and government institutions. He was also a director of Warsaw office of German Marshall Fund of the United States. I would also like to very cordially welcome a person who on Thursday will deliver a lecture closing our conference, Professor John Mizgiel, lecturer at the Center for East European Studies, University of Warsaw, and professor at the Columbia University. On Thursday, he will deliver a lecture entitled Polish-American Relations Today. But I will tell more about him on Thursday. The main focus of this year's conference will be an exploration of common issues around social and political life, transformation in politics and policies, in economics, partnership of post-communist countries, international relations, law system, as well as the people's state of mind, transformation in culture, everyday life, and common views. It builds upon the highly successful meetings where educators, lecturers, researchers, experts, and students on several sides of the border are engaged in rich and productive dialogue regarding the latest history of our region. Thanks to the support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Executive Department of Public and Cultural Diplomacy, we were able to invite prominent and distinguished guests from the countries of our region. Mrs. Renata Cytacka, Vice Minister of the Government of Lithuania, Mr. Boris Nemtsov from Russia, former Vice Prime Minister of Russia, of Russian Federation, Mr. Ruben Mehrabian from Armenia, Mr. Alexander Milinkiewicz, Andrzej Samicha, and Stanisław Szuszkiewicz from Belarus, Mikołaj Ryabczuk and Boris Tarasiuk from Ukraine. The above-mentioned guests, together with excellent Polish specialists, will participate in 3 roundtables devoted this year to the 3 key countries, we suppose, key countries of the post-Soviet region, and all having the same main title, Shifting Frontiers. The first roundtable, Belarus Today, Stabilization versus Destabilization. Roundtable 2, Ukraine towards Europe. Of course, it is more interesting, particularly interesting before Vilnius EU Summit. And roundtable 3, Russia and its neighbors. This year, as usual, we gather a group of excellent academicians and researchers, both experienced and acknowledged, as well as young and only starting their their academic careers. Very warmly, I would like to welcome all the finalists and listeners of this year's Warsaw East European Conference. from all over the world. After the introductions and greetings, I can only wish all the guests a successful conference, and it must really start to our conference, to our session. It is already became a tradition of our conference that we always host a minister or vice minister of foreign affairs of Poland of the inaugural ceremony. This year we have the honor to host Minister Artur Nowak-Far, an Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Professor of European Law, Professor at the Adam Mickiewicz University at Poznań, and Warsaw School of Economics. His today's speech will be not only a presentation on behalf of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but above all, a result of Minister Nowak-Far's scientific interests and research. What for us during an academic conference is an really excellent situation. Therefore, I would like to ask Minister Nowak-Far to deliver his speech entitled Schemes of Socio-Economic Transformation in Central and Eastern Europe. Please, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me here and to, well, sort of open the conference for you. Indeed, my topic is the schemes of socio-economic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm going to present our outline of the results of the research which was conducted under the head of Professor Żubrowska, Katarzyna Żubrowska of the Warsaw School of Economics, and well, which has been continued for all the recent years. First of all, it is, in my opinion, quite essential to define what socio-economic transformation really is. In Central and Eastern Europe, it is definitely a multi-phase phenomenon. First, in the political system, it is a transition from a monoparty or communistic party hegemony to a pluralistic system where popular preferences can be expressed through periodical public elections, which is quite important because otherwise those preferences cannot be really realized, and with the monoparty system we have simply a very limited group of people who decide what other major groups of people would like, which is, well, not a very good system. In the economic system, the socio-economic transformation should be understood as a transition which occurs from a grossly regulated and state-planned control mode of conducting economic affairs to some sort of market system where the state functions in the economic realm are largely constrained. In the social system, the socio-economic transformation represents a transition from significantly uniform type of the society to a much more diversified one in terms of the economic status, political influence, political economic focus, and so on. There is no one scheme of socio-economic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe. In the case of the transformation which commenced in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989-1990, there had been only one, in my opinion, major common stimulus. That was the collapse of Soviet economy, which led to dramatic deterioration of economic performance in the region. However, when the multi-phased nature of this phenomenon is concerned, one has to know that the very content of each of the phases differed in each of the countries concerned. Moreover, the starting point situation and stimuli which trigger the transformation were normally different for each such country. Of course, Poland was the first to trigger the transformation process, but soon it was followed by many other countries. Each had its own reasons, which had its own slightly separate agenda, but all wanting to improve the situation and move on another track of economic and social development. Well, the example of Poland is, in my opinion, very teaching. The transformation here was to a large extent based on the legitimizing and expansion of the already existing de jure and de facto private sector. Sometimes we were told that, well, the great deal of this private sector was the agricultural sector, which was, generally privately owned. But this is not actually, in my opinion, the truth. The truth is that we had the private sector de facto, maybe not de jure, because it was to a great extent delegitimized, which flourished in other sectors of the economy. In my opinion, too much emphasis is put on the importance of the agricultural sector in Poland and the private ownership of it. The argument which I would like to present here is grossly economic. When we look how it worked, how it had worked really, I will very easily find out that that agricultural sector was subject to a very stringent control, and it operated according to the lines which were created by the state. In other words, we had the private ownership of the farms, but we had the control of resources and also the control of all economic activity which occurred at the state level. And therefore, the situation was a little bit more complicated than sometimes presented. This private ownership of the agricultural sector was not that important, that significant to the further development of events in Poland. Well, but with the very good deal of private sector in the economy, irrespective of this very important reservation which concerns the agricultural sector, we are very legitimized to say that the change in Poland was a result of a long and procrastinated period of delegitimization of the old system, also within the ruling elite. And, it was heavily influenced by the Western patterns. That means that in Poland, we looked at the Western patterns of the economy, social life, and so on, and we tried to somehow implement it in our country. Well, irrespective of this example, we can also say that the transformation countries have so far differed in terms of models adopted to two things. To the legitimization of the old system, which itself had a direct bearing on the presence of the old system's element in the new order, and the legitimization of an emerging system. The legitimization patterns appear to be very interesting, very intriguing. It is normally it involved the headlines. One of the most important headlines was the concept of modernization. But as we all know, the concept of modernization is tends to be a little bit misleading, because we normally would have to answer one very important question: what this modernization really means. And besides that, we can always, when we deal with modernization, conclude that it involves the legitimization of some old patterns people do not believe that they are in place and working well, and they tend to replace the old system with something new, something they believe is better, and something they therefore label modernization. First wave of modernization in the Central and Eastern European countries was sort of westernization, that is injecting or mimicking some really important pieces of or solutions which have long been in place in the Western countries, irrespective of their origin. But when we look at the Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian example, then we very easily find out that very soon after the two first days of transformation, they've applied a different sort of modernization. That was the modernization which was gouged. That means somehow directed with some ready to apply models, and that was the sort of modernization a la the European communities, because they very soon went on the track of the integration with the European communities, and they wanted to be very quickly integrated with the communities themselves. Well, that created some benefits and some costs. The major benefit was that the model so applied was ready to go, ready to apply, and it was proven. The cost of it was that, well, the integration has not occurred immediately, that it required a great deal of effort, energy, and even it involved a serious cost, namely in terms of the transfer of wealth, to some extent from the various societal groups, most importantly from the Eastern and Central European consumers to the Western European producers. But anyway, overall, when we look at the picture after the transformation, when we look at the results of it, the assessment needs to be, or must be, very positive, because our country or our region has developed very quickly, and it is still a source of vigor to the entire European Union. Well, that would be the end of my speech, because that is meant to be only an introduction to all the possible areas which would be tackled during the conference. But I need also to note that, well, this is the 10th issue, 10th edition of so good a conference, and therefore I use this as an opportunity to congratulate you, and especially Professor Malicki, for the splendid achievements which has been made for all these years, and for the great accumulation of knowledge about the developments in our region, and the knowledge of the process of transformation. And, well, may I say that we are very much looking forward to a success of this edition of the conference. Thank you again for inviting me to the conference. Thank you again for giving me the floor and the opportunity to share with you some thoughts about the patterns of the transformation in our region. Thank you.
Dear Minister Nowak-Kwar, thank you for your kind words about our conference, and thank you for congratulations. And for your speech. As I said before, not only on behalf of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but exactly in the center of our interests. Now I would like to invite Professor Andrew Michta As I said, Professor Michta is a professor of Rhodes College and specializing in problems of NATO security, transatlantic security system, security policy. Professor Michta will deliver inaugural lecture Central and Eastern Europe in US security policy. And you do have interesting information for us.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again, Professor Malitsky, for inviting me to this terrific event and for keeping it going 10 years in a row. This is quite an achievement. So I'm delighted to be here. Glad to see my friend John Mitskill over there. Thank you for coming. Actually, this early in the morning. I know. Before I proceed, I'd like to say one thing to make it absolutely clear that what I have to say today does not reflect any official position of the U.S. government, or any of other governments for that matter, or even my wife's. And this is this was a lame attempt at humor. These will be my comments as somebody who has spent the last 20-some years looking at security issues in the region. I'm going to do 4 things today. I want to tell you a little bit about what happened post-2008 in American security policy. 2008 is now clearly an inflection point in how we have looked at transatlantic relations, great power relations in the world, and the U.S. role in international affairs. 2008 is when the presidential election brought about an administration change in the United States. We moved from the Republican administration of George W. Bush to the Democrat administration of Barack Obama. It was also the year during which, for some of you who follow NATO affairs, at the Bucharest summit in NATO, Ukraine and Georgia were denied the membership action plan, despite the fact that the U.S. administration at that time, President Bush, publicly called for beginning the process of accession for those 2 countries. In fact, in 2008 in Bucharest, we didn't have enough horsepower to even get the Macedonians into the mix of the Adriatic Three because of the issues of how the state should be called, whether Macedonia or former Yugoslav republics. And then in 2008, we also had the Russo-Georgian War, which dramatically shifted our perception of what constitutes the future of warfare, or the future of security challenges and threats. Because the Russo-Georgian War brought state-on-state violence back to the periphery of Europe, something that we've been told for years prior to that was not going to happen. And these 3 events, and especially the summit in Bucharest and the Russo-Georgian War, effectively began the process of what I would call the consolidation of the new boundary, or the new periphery of what is called generically the West, or the transatlantic community. The kind of open process of West to East enlargement that had defined the policies of Europe and the United States beginning in 1990 and moving on through the rounds of NATO enlargement, EU enlargement, and so forth, in effect halted in 2008. And although the officials continue to speak of the future enlargement of Europe, future enlargement of NATO to the East, and so forth, this is still on the agenda. The sad reality is that this has now been effectively moved into the realm of theory, especially when it comes to the future of NATO. And what that means is that the back pressure has begun to build in 2008, and the momentum is now shifting, where what we used to call Eastern Europe and countries of Eastern Partnership, especially Ukraine, are now the centerpiece of competition of who's going to influence and define this region. So I'm going to say a few things about what that meant for the U.S. administration of Barack Obama coming in. Then I will talk about what now drives American debate on security policy. And what it is very simple. It's the economy. We are in yet another year of what some of my colleagues call the Great Recession of 2008. The worst risks have been temporarily pushed away or averted through various policies of the Fed in the United States, or taking a different tack. The attitude, the approach that the Germans tried to advance here in Europe, but nonetheless, we're still looking at a context of very low growth, very high unemployment, and most important for the United States, a real gathering of a debt crisis in my country. Just to put some numbers on this, U.S. combined debt is now over $16 trillion. Our total GDP in 2012 was $15.8 trillion. We're running deficits of approximately, $1 trillion annually, something that used to be inconceivable. At the end of the administration, of this administration of Barack Obama, our combined public debt will be approximately $20.2 trillion if the growth rates proceed as they are. There is no other priority when it comes to foreign and security policy in the United States than getting our economic house in order. Now, if you look at these numbers, then you begin to realize that we're approaching the territory of a charming country called Greece when it comes to the debt to GDP ratio. Of course, we're not Greece. The United States is an extremely wealthy country with a very, very strong economy in terms of the amount of money available for investment, the strength of our institutions, our innovation, our universities, and on and on and on. So these comparisons are very, very flat and actually not accurate. But the fact remains that we are, for the first time in this kind of environment, in a resource-constrained environment. Why is it important? Because when you look at American foreign policy and security policy prior to this cycle, we have always had what I call the excess of power. America had the margin of strength, of resources, that always allowed us, having made a mistake somewhere and things not working very well, to shape and try all over again. That's the story of the post-Vietnam. That's the story of various crises and conflicts that we've experienced. We've always operated on this margin of having excess of power that allowed each successive administration to engage in a very proactive policy. This is a new experience. The new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he was coming into the office and he was being interviewed, General Dempsey at that time said, the first trip I'm going to take will be to my alma mater, to West Point. And I'm not going to talk to my professors of strategy, but I'm going to talk to my professors of economics. The United States military now is in the process of very substantial cuts, very dramatic cuts, at a time when it is exiting from the period of over a decade of extremely active operational deployments. If you look at the last decade of the so-called global war on terror, which is no longer called the global war on terror, it's now called overseas contingency operations, or whatever you want to call it, essentially two very protracted campaigns, one in Iraq, the other one in Afghanistan. We have never had that tempo since the end of the Second World War of military operations. Okay? Meaning that the U.S. military needs to be recapitalized, rebuilt, and reinvested in. And what that means is there's tremendous competition going on for money. So if anybody asks you why the United States is not taking on a more proactive view of global affairs, some of it is an economic constraint. Very, very simply economic constraint. It's the need to find a way, especially under the sequestration that we have today, to balance the books, or at least not to continue going deeper into the hole. To put it in perspective, from George Washington until the Clinton administration, the United States accumulated about $5 trillion of public debt. Okay? From the George W. Bush administration through the Obama administration, we will triple that. Okay? And the reason is, essentially, there is no ability, there's no consensus domestically to figure out how to reconcile the competing priorities, how to reform various programs that we have in place, and especially Social Security and insurance programs. So, having laid out this context, keep that in mind. The United States remains committed globally. The United States remains a global power, but it is also operating under very severe resource constraints and is exiting from 2 wars. And we don't know yet, despite various estimates, what the actual costs of those wars will be. I had a conversation the other day with the Surgeon General of the European Command who told me, he's a medical doctor, a physician, he said he's very proud that he's able to save approximately 60% more American lives, combat injuries, than he did when he was starting off as a second lieutenant in Vietnam. And that is a wonderful thing in terms of both paying homage to these heroes who went to fight for their country and saving the lives on a very basic humanitarian level. But what it also means is that these young men and women with serious injuries will live in our veteran administration system, probably for decades until they have reached their 70s or late 60s. And that means that it's also an unseen cost of war. The rebuilding of the US military is an unseen cost of war. We don't really know how much money those campaigns can cost us. And then there's the intensity of deployments, the ratio of peace to wartime operations. During the entire Cold War, we're running at about 2.1 to 1. For every two months, roughly, of peacetime, the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines were deployed for 1 month. The ratio over the past decade is almost 1 to 1. And we have an all-volunteer military, essentially 0.5% of the total population of the United States is fighting all the country's war, because since Nixon ended the draft, we've shifted in that direction. That's my first point, resource constraints. The second point is the change of administration. With the arrival of Barack Obama, several things have happened. One was essentially the winding down of what I once described as the neoconservative moment in American foreign and security policy. If you remember the George W. Bush administration, how the United States reacted to the post-9/11 crisis. The United States engaged after 9/11 into probably one of the most active and protracted and sustained projects of nation building, state building, and systemic transformation that I can remember. The United States not only moved in Afghanistan during the military operations against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but also took upon itself the responsibility of addressing the root causes of radicalism, building systems, building states, the terms that floated all over various military academies and universities, state building, nation building, and things like that. Right? It's a very similar experience that we had in the initial phases of the Iraq campaign. The neoconservative argument was that the United States was uniquely positioned in 1990 with the demise of the Soviet Union to use its preponderant position in global affairs to bring about a sustained transformation in some of the key areas of the world. By the time Barack Obama has come into office in 2008, there was growing disappointment with that. The cost was proving to be prohibitive. The initial assumptions were proving to be difficult to sustain. We were in effect engaged in a protracted guerrilla war on two theaters with the global kind of countering of radicalism and Islamism on top of that all. So when Obama came into office, he wanted to do two things. He wanted first and foremost to be a domestic president. It's ironic about a lot of American presidents who come into office, they want to do domestic affairs, and then whoops, stuff happens. Things happen internationally, they drag you into this. And Obama came with a determination to close the Iraqi operation as quickly as possible, and he has partially agreed through the so-called surge to surge the Afghan operation, but then put a deadline on withdrawal, 2014. We are now at that moment in history, which is going to be a critical development for NATO. How NATO handles the post-ISAF experience, where there will be a lot of finger-pointing with the defense cuts that are now basically the rule of the day in Europe, will define whether or not this alliance has a lot of life left in it, and what kind of an alliance it will emerge in the end. So when Obama comes into office, he decided to restructure the way the United States engaged globally. Okay? The policy of engagement was to reach out to the difficult states. And for the purpose of our conversation, one of those states was Russia. You remember the reset, right, of the Obama administration. Poorly translated into Russian, I believe into Peregruska or some such. But it was an effort to reach out to the Russians, not because the administration, in my view, saw Russia as a partner. I don't think very many people in Washington, Democrats or Republicans, see Russia as a great partner in building a better world. but because it saw Russia as a potential spoiler, a state that through its actions can make other initiatives, like in the Middle East, difficult or impossible to implement. And there was one more aspect of President Obama's first-term agenda that was critical to him, and it still remains very important. That was the nuclear issue. Nuclear proliferation and disarmament issue. You may remember two speeches. One was at the Prague Palace, right, in Prague. The other one at the UN, when the president called for, in effect, a denuclearized world, getting rid of the nuclear weapons. And we had started negotiations with the Russians to cut substantially the nuclear stockpile. That remains part of President Obama's agenda. I think it goes beyond simply a matter of calculus. It is a matter of belief, faith, of the kind of ideological viewpoint, if you will, of this administration. The administration also believed that the power was diffusing away from Europe, and that those rising powers needed to be either engaged or contained or both. And you may remember in 2012, the administration issued new strategic guidance for the U.S. Military and security structures, for the first time talking about the pivot to Asia, something that it ran away from very, very quickly because of what it implied. What was interesting in the strategic guidance was the following. The United States during the Cold War usually tried to balance two theaters of operation. We tried to look to the Atlantic and the Pacific as two areas where we had to be prepared to engage. America is, by definition, an island nation on a continental scale, right? I mean, if you look at the map of the United States, we're like Great Britain writ large, right? We're this ginormous continent sitting out there with a lot of threatening Canadians to the north and very scary Mexicans to the south, and a lot of water in both directions. Which means we've always operated on this very broad margin of security, being able to engage forward, to deploy forward. If you look at the structure of American deployments, after the Second World War, during the Cold War, NATO across the Atlantic in Europe, our basing in Japan, our basing in the Philippines, across the Pacific, it also made us essentially embrace a truly global set of commitments. In 2012, President Obama for the first time said, we are going to emphasize one direction more over the other. And we're going to now expect of our military to fight one war, and one that was described in the guidance as a spoiling campaign. So no more two-war formula, no more two theaters. We are now in this new resource-constrained environment. We're constraining our focus increasingly to Asia-Pacific because that is now the most dynamically growing and rapidly expanding area. And then how do we deal with a crisis area like the Middle East? You may remember President Obama takes his trip to Cairo just before the Arab Spring and makes a speech essentially reaching out to the Muslim community saying America and Islam are not incompatible, we can work together. So what that meant was that the US was going to reach out to the difficult states, if you will. That meant Russia, that meant Pakistan, that meant trying to figure out a modus vivendi with Iran, although Iran is viewed as one of the principal threats when it comes to nuclear proliferation. And what it also meant that by default, and this is bad news in Europe, this is not by design, this is by default, Europe was becoming less and less important. Europe is a success story. Basically, the view was, the job is done. This is a very wealthy part of the world. Wonderful roads, excellent croissants, as I can testify. Great, fantastic museums. Yeah, maybe not very innovative, but, you know, it's a comfortable, as one colleague described, vacation land. No, I'm not being fair. Europe was viewed as a success, and especially Central and Eastern Europe, the topic of our conference today, which was the focal point of the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration made the key decisions on bringing Central and Eastern Europe into NATO. Okay? All of a sudden, the pervasive mood in Washington became Central and Eastern Europe is a done deal. It's done. Look at your young, bright faces. You're all Europeans. You're traveling to Berlin, Paris, Erasmus scholarship. Everything's fine. You're getting European structural funds. You will rebuild Europe whole and free and at peace. Of course, we know that's not really the case, and we know that there are a lot of problems out there, but it's all relative. China. Under the Obama administration, China really emerges as the #1 focus of US foreign and security policy. Because it is at that time that we're beginning to realize what the so-called globalization has brought to bear on the United States. I don't know if you saw today's news, China's growth rate is projected to drop this year to a terrible 7.5% or 7%. It would be so lucky, right? What's the projected growth rate in the Eurozone? Anybody knows? Minus 0.8 for this year. This is the brutal arithmetic of what's going on in Asia right now. It's the productivity rates and manpower and something that never existed before, but that globalization brought about technology transfer. The Chinese are not geniuses that all of a sudden discovered a magical stone about how to grow these wonderful iPhones and do other things. The United States, the West more generally, but essentially the United States for 3 decades now has been in effect transferring our industrial base to Asia in order to supply the domestic market. And in the process, we have transferred technologies, processes, design, and things of that nature. I'll give you an example. Apple Computer in California, where I lived for a while, employs about 50,000 people in the United States. It employs close to 1 million in China in manufacturing. Most of the stuff that's done in Cupertino and other places is done in design. Most of the manufacturing is done over there. Why is it important? Because for those of you who remember the Cold War, there was one remarkable thing that the Soviets could never achieve. The Soviets could acquire Western designs. They could reverse engineer our weapon systems. They could do all sorts of things looking at the parameters. They could never really build them. Because a lot of the engineering excellence and tradition and prowess that the West has historically enjoyed is in the materials technology, in the processes, in the design, and what we broadly call technological culture. So the Russians could actually, acquire, let's say, a Sidewinder missile and take it apart and try to build their own Strela equivalent, but it was never up to those levels of performance. Actually, you may remember at NATO we had the so-called COCOM restrictions that limited the transfer of technology to the Soviet bloc countries, and that included, for example, believe it or not, 386 computer chips, those that power your first IBM PC. Why? Because the Soviets could not build consistently clean rooms to manufacture wafers in large enough quantities to build their own systems. They were terrific when it came to software design, algorithms, math, and all of that stuff, but they're always catching it. Why do I say this? Because what has happened over the past 30 years is the massive transfer of know-how that is beginning to narrow the bandwidth between the kind of armed forces and technologies that the West can field and the kind of technology that the Chinese are beginning to field. And China is no different in that respect than any other rising state. It is rapidly modernizing, industrializing, it's becoming more and more geostrategically assertive in its region, it's becoming more nationalistic, and we have a problem. The problem that we have is that the United States is the preeminent Pacific Ocean security provider. The pivot to Asia was, for Obama, to some extent a response to the growing chorus of concern coming from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, and countries like that. That in fact the Chinese were assuming an ever more dominant position at the expense of American interests and regional allies. And Obama claimed that the George W. Bush administration, with its focus on fighting radical Islamism, was overlooking Asia, so we were refocusing into Asia. We have real flashpoints in Asia. Why is Asia important? Asia is very much like a 19th century security environment. It's unstructured. If you look at the transatlantic security environment, you have NATO, you have European Union, you have a number of bilaterals. You have various institutions that constrain individual players. Plus, lo and behold, most of the countries in this region share the same set of values about how you organize the economy, free markets, freedom of the individual, and so forth, liberty, broadly construed. None of this applies in Asia Pacific. You, in fact, have rapidly rising powers, you have rapidly declining powers, and you have an unstructured, open environment with outstanding territorial disputes. So what the Obama administration was doing was actually addressing the real need. The Middle East caught us all by surprise. The Middle East is one more reason why Europe is now becoming less and less of the focal point of American security policy. We got the Middle East wrong. Again, remember President Obama's visit to Cairo, his outreach to the Muslim community, and then the so-called Arab Spring followed, which very quickly became actually the Arab Fall, or the fall of jihad, the fall of disintegration. If you look at the situation today in Syria, it is also assuming elements, aspects of traditional great power competition. With the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians entering the picture and using the ongoing civil strife in the region to reestablish their areas of influence. And there are countries that are hanging in the balance that can make all of this an absolute #1 priority. Think of the consequences of an explosion in Jordan. Think of what that means to the security of Israel when the West Bank opens up. I don't even want to think of the consequences long-term of this kind of an environment. That means, again, the U.S. security priorities go Asia, then go to the Middle East, because of what's happening in the Middle East. But because of resource constraints, there's one thing that's different this time. This is the first administration, I would argue, since the Carter administration, that has been reluctant to take the point and assume the leadership position. It sees its role more as a convener, organizer. The term that you hear sometimes is leading from behind. Look at the Libyan operation, for example. American power remains essential and indispensable, but the United States is very reluctant to take on additional leadership responsibilities. And what happens as a result, unfortunately, is that you see more and more instability in those regions. We're caught in this paradox. The constrained resources which say, look inward, rebuild the infrastructure. And the U.S. is very well positioned to do so. In case you haven't noticed, we are in the midst of an energy revolution in the United States. We're a #1 producer of natural gas because of shale gas revolutionary technology. We're going to be a #1 producer of oil probably because of the new in-situ hydrothermic shale oil technology. The United States is poised to rebuild its manufacturing base because our energy is now about 3 times cheaper than you guys had, not to mention of what this is going to do to our relationships with other regions of the world. So there's this impetus to look inward rather than looking outwards. So where does it leave Europe? I want to leave some time for questions. Where does it leave Europe? 2 things that are extremely disturbing in my view when it comes to the future of transatlantic relations. One of them is what's happening in America in terms of public opinion. Pew Global Research Center just published a study saying that for the first time we have a majority of Americans wanting to disengage. They want less international engagement globally. We also have a very disturbing change when it comes to generational views of Europe. When I ran the GMF office, we had the Transatlantic Trend study that showed last year that in the generation of some of the students sitting here in this room, the generation of 18 to 25, American undergraduate students, 75% of the respondents believe Asia was more important to America's future than Europe. And this was a sliding scale as we traveled through age groups. We went then into 30, 35, 35, 45. Only when you got to the John McCain generation, the generation that fought in Vietnam, or when you got to the great generation, the greatest generation of World War II, will these numbers reverse. This is very bad news when it comes to how the future leaders of the United States look at Europe. The Europeans were still saying America is more important to them than Asia, but more and more Americans were saying it's actually one of those. So that's the first one. Second trend, in any alliance there has to be mutuality of interests. It's good if there is also mutuality of values, but there has to be mutuality of contribution. Right? NATO during the Cold War, even though it was an alliance, sovereign states, was a very unbalanced alliance, as you all know. It was an alliance in which the United States was and still is the primus inter pares, right? Because at the fundamental level of strategic deterrence, NATO was a de facto unilateral nuclear strategic guarantee to Western Europe. As long as the Soviet power was located across the border, the United States would provide that kind of deterrence and defense if need be. What changed radically during the Balkan Wars was that the Americans suddenly discovered that even in a conflict on European territory, Europe was unable to succeed in putting it out, in controlling it, in managing it. Think back of what happened in the 1990s in the Balkans. Failures of the UN. People don't have high expectations when it comes to the UN and security issues are given to the A failure of the European Union, the European community of nations, of being able to address essentially war in their own environment. And that in the end it took NATO and the Americans to come in and put it out. What we discovered in the Balkans that we essentially stood up the alliance theory on its head. Because if you take classes on IR theory and look at alliances, the most standard argument is if you go to fight in an alliance, you pool your resources, right? So you pay a higher political premium, you pay higher transaction costs in the area of decision making when you fight in an alliance. And we saw this in the Balkans. The French have to agree that we will take this battery out from the Serbian whatever. The Germans have to agree to something else. The British, the Poles, that's normal. Transaction costs in politics go higher. But your military transaction costs are supposed to go down because you're pooling your resources. And to our great surprise, we discovered that, in fact, most of the military capabilities, especially on the high end of the spectrum, had to be American. That even the most established Western allies, with 2 or 3 exceptions, were unable to be fully interoperable. And that what the Europeans could perform in the aftermath of the Balkan campaign was essentially stability and security follow-up operation. As one Pentagon official once in a very uncharitable way said, the Americans cooked the dinner and the Europeans did the dishes. But you can't sustain that over time. And what's interesting with every successful campaign, even though the Europeans were aware of that, remember Saint-Malo and the talk about European security and defense policy, battle groups, all this kind of stuff, nothing happened. Look around Europe today. Europe is de facto demilitarized. Okay? In 2008, 8 countries in Europe, traditional European allies, provided 50% of NATO's hard power when you look at the capabilities. Today, the United States provides over 70% of all NATO capabilities. Some Europeans can't even conduct regular military exercises. We happen to be in a country that's a noble exception to this. Poland is unique, and that is recognized in Washington. And I'm getting to the concluding remarks of my presentation, so that is and will be appreciated. Poland is serious about military power. Poland is spending money on defense. Most of the Europeans are disarmed. The Brits without Harrier jets. The French with 53% of their expenditures on personnel. Remember what happened in Mali. And the French are one of the 3 or 4 countries that are serious still about some military capabilities. Why do I say all of this? It's not that I want all the Europeans to all of a sudden, tote a gun and salute and run around. I'm trying to tell you that in the era of constrained resources in America, your value, European value, as a security provider is growing exponentially. The United States needs Europe today to be a real partner on security issues. And unfortunately, the trends are different. They're moving in different directions. The experiences of Afghanistan, in many ways, were very, very negative. Because if you look at the numbers of troops deployed under ISAF from Europe, that's one thing. But if you look at the caveats they had imposed upon them, some countries could not fly medevacs into combat areas, others couldn't operate at night, others couldn't have their jets armed, and on and on and on. Those caveats, in effect, nullified about 50% of the Europeans' ISAF providers. Now, again, countries from the former Soviet bloc, the Estonians, the Poles, they were the real fighters. They went in there, and that was recognized and credited. So what's happening today is that as the United States is increasingly refocusing on its new obligations, it wants more from Europe on the security and military front. And unfortunately, Europe, because it is itself in crisis, cannot provide that, or will not provide that, or there is no political will to provide that. And maybe Poland is an exception simply because your 1.95% of GDP on defense is guaranteed by your parliament, by law. And if that law were not in place, who knows what the situation would be. So where are we today? The United States is cutting its military. The Army goes from 570,000 to 520,000. The Marine Corps from 202,000 to 186,000. We're in effect rolling back most of the increases we had during the so-called global war on terror. Our Navy needs to be recapitalized. We have a smaller Navy today. We have a smaller Navy today than at any time since 1917. We need to build up because traditional power projection is necessary. And hence there is more distance between Europe and the United States. What to do? Because it's very easy to go negative, complain, and say the world is complicated. In a very perverse and strange way, I would argue, Europe and the United States today are in an orders of magnitude better position, economically speaking, despite all the crises and all the problems and things, than it was after the Second World War. I think we can all agree to this. Europe was literally on its back in 1945. The US was 50% of the global GDP at that time. And yet Europe, because of the quality of its leadership and its clarity, was able to punch above its weight, coming out with such interesting, innovative, and ultimately grand ideas as the larger European project, embedded in the construct of transatlantic security. The big ideas are missing in Europe today. Europe is becoming more and more regionalized. And in a strange way, the United States has fewer and fewer partners to engage with, to address those large ideas. I don't know how to explain this. Some people say this is a crisis of leadership. But the fact remains that the United States' focus is shifting away from Europe, and unless the Europeans come up with some ideas, some formulas, some reason why we should continue to work together, this devolution will continue. And what could that idea be? Among some of the cliches you hear every day is the West and the rise of the rest. Or if you like Tom Friedman, China America is emerging. We will recycle our own debt for Chinese surpluses and everything will just kind of roll forward. And the rise of the rest simply means that the rest will kind of get up there, and the Indians and the Chinese will acquire a certain per capita income, will modernize, industrialize, and they will enter into the established order as there is today. We may hope that that's going to be the case. I tend to be a political realist when it comes to how state behavior. So I would actually argue this is not exactly the case. And what we see today is the West and the rise of the different. That the conversation you're going to see over the next 10 years will be a conversation about the nature of the global order and about the institutions and, yes, values that are going to inform that order. And if you look at the trends, and again, I always tell my students, trends need not become outcomes, but if you look at current trends, China will become the largest economy. 2040, 2035, 2045, different models, different ideas. But as I said, the trends are there. For Eurozone, the minus 0.8 growth rate this year, essentially decline, contraction. For China, 7% growth rate. Almost 4 decades of sustained double-digit expansion. That is unheard of. That is revolutionary. And the logic follows from that. So what we're going to look at is a fundamental shift in the distribution of power at the level of individual countries. But Europe and the United States working together changes that equation. That's why the free trade agreement between Europe and the United States is of such critical importance. Because if you combine the resources, institutional, economic, political, military, of Europe and the United States, we will be able to continue to preserve the open liberal order that we've built. And the other players entering that system will need to adapt. But if we don't, we will live in a very different world. And I'll conclude on one comment here. What's also different in this era for my country is that the United States, for the first time, is facing the potential peer competitor that may have a larger economy than we do going forward. Since 1812, since the Brits burned the White House, that has never been the case. The United States working with Europe, with the capacity of the European economies, the institutional strength of Europe, and the larger collective West, can counter that. Where does it leave Poland? Last comment. I know that John will address that, but I'm just going to give a segue into it. I think Poland has won a lottery ticket of the century, the millennium, or whatever. What happened in 1989, the previous generation could probably only dream about it. The young people in the audience, this probably means nothing because this is the normal for you. You grew up with you. But Poland's historical geostrategic curse was always so close to Russia and Germany, so far away from God, right? Being in this environment. Poland that was always condemned to this quintessentially peripheral status ever since the Commonwealth disintegrated and Poland was partitioned. And the skeptics to this day, I have a colleague, for example, who argues that this has not changed and that Poland remains in this peripheral position. Just happens to be the periphery of the West today and not the periphery of the East. I take issue with that. I think Poland has a historic chance to really undo some of the givens of its geostrategic position. It has a chance to absorb a tremendous amount of money that's coming in by virtue of its presence in membership in the European Union. But it also needs hard security guarantees and a strong security relationship with the United States. It will need that at least for another decade or maybe two. Not because tomorrow tanks are rolling across the river or some horrible things will happen, but because the shifting distribution of power, the disarming of Europe, the kind of changes you see in Russia, the military modernization plans, however of that will fail, because I don't have any illusions that the Russians will be able to do what they say. But nonetheless, the balance in the region will be shifting. So Poland can become the leader, the voice, taking charge in trying to reconnect and renew the transatlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I apologize for going a bit over time, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Professor Miftah, thank you for your lecture. Not only about security, US security for East Central Europe, perhaps partly, in parts, in fragments, about US and the world, but from the point of view from our, here from Central Europe, perhaps we are thinking that it is very, very important point, but seeing from Washington, perhaps not. Okay, we have an occasion, I suppose, for one, perhaps two questions before starting with our panels. Any questions?
Professor Miftah, in the context of military supplies and the possibility of buying different kinds of equipment, are the Americans really not going to compete for anti-missile systems in Poland? Is it possible that the United States would be buying Rosomaks from Poland?
Do you know what is Rosomak?
That's the Polish ABC that's built on the Finnish platform Patria and has been modified and is produced locally. John, that's a very good question. As far as I know, the U.S. companies are competing to be the suppliers of the Polish AMD system. Two major competitors are Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. They're offering two slightly different solutions, but with a lot of interconnectivity if you look at the details. And of course, the two other players are the Israelis and the French. As far as I understand, this is the process that has begun in terms of evaluating the technical requirements. I've been asked these questions before, if Poland should go with the American solution or the Israeli solution. preferred solution? And my answer is really very simple, and I'm not trying to be cute. Poland should buy the ABM system that's best for Poland, that meets Polish needs. And what that requires is very close discussion. There will be a technology dialogue here in about a month. It requires a lot of discussion, information sharing, close cooperation to come up with a resolution. This is not just a technical decision, this is also quintessentially a political decision. Just as the F-16 purchase was not just a military platform decision, it was a political decision. The Poland that bought the F-16 aircraft was a very different country. Poland that is going to be buying an ABM system is a very different country. The money that's at stake is huge. You're talking about, for Poland, $5 billion on a system. That's a lot of money. Polish modernization overall is something that flows against the trend in Europe. In terms of selling Polish-made equipment to the United States, some of these restrictions are contract restrictions with the Finns because of the licensing procedures. And unfortunately, they put Poland in a very tight spot. I don't want to be too technical, but just to give you a brief analogy. The Rosomak is one of the most successful armed personnel carrier platforms tested in Afghanistan, with a number of modifications that the Polish military introduced. But it's still a licensed product from Finland. In effect, the Poles took what was not really a tested platform, innovated on it, built a very good product. But the licensing agreement also specifies where these weapons can be marketed. They're largely directing Poland to market in Asia and Africa and places like that. And there's another problem in those markets. The Rosomak is like a Mercedes of today's platforms. Relatively poor country in Asia or Africa can purchase 3 Ukrainian BTRs for the price of one Rosomak. So it's not just a question of how licensing is written, it's also a question of the relative value and cost. I'm a great proponent of defense industry cooperation. I think the Polish defense sector has a lot to offer. What is needed, I think, is more direct conversation, more interaction, and getting to know what the governments expect and are ready to do and what the industry can provide. And here I've worked in Polish security for the past 20 years. I've seen a problem of the following kind. Because there's always concern about potential corruption, influence peddling, and things like that. Poland built a number of safeguards that, in my view, are on occasion actually damaging to this kind of dialogue. You need the industry and the government in the same room if you're to find out what it is that you want. This applies not just to the defense sector, it applies to the shale gas energy sector. You need close cooperation, close discussion before you start placing orders. As a Polish American, I would love to see close cooperation between the Polish and the American defense industry. And if you look at the systems that are tested, I think we have something there that's unique. But again, that's a decision that the Polish government should make based on their requirements, the kind of strategy that they're operating under.
Thank you. And second, we have only 10 minutes on the second question for Professor Wojcicki. But Kazimierz, question, not lecture.
Yeah, not a lecture. My question is to Professor Mita, as Polish American, especially observing the Polish politics, our discussions. I share your opinion that our geopolitical position is quite new, and it could give Poland quite a new role in Europe, not this in-between Russia and Germany, but quite new. But what do you think about our discussions in Poland? It is not a situation that there's certain inertia of seeing Poland in between. Secondly, Polish people are tired of the history, and they are not so eager to discuss about geopolitical questions And that is where even if some politicians could have these great ideas to push this medium-sized country as Poland to bigger politics, they couldn't have the support in the public opinion.
Thank you very much, Professor. I've been here for almost 2 years. We're going back home in 2 weeks. The thing that struck me shortly after I arrived, when I looked at the policy debates, is that national security priorities in Poland tend to be driven by partisan considerations, partyjne, to a much greater extent than I see in a number of other countries. In other words, what I miss in Poland is a larger elite consensus of the kind you had when Poland was joining NATO. Poland was joining the NATO alliance. It didn't matter if I talked to a post-communist, a guy from Solidarity, so there was a clear sense of where the country should be going. And they could fight on the margins of that, but they were all determined that Poland was returning to its rightful place in Western civilization, that it needed to move in that direction. And was going to pay whatever price in terms of norm settings was required of Poland. That has, to a large extent, I think, vanished. I would like to see more of a discussion of the changes that have already taken place. I think the Polish public is much smarter than a lot of politicians give it credit. Okay? People engaged in a direct way on these issues. I know that in the international context, Poland has a much poorer image still than the reality that I know here. The image that you have in the United States, especially, well, if you get outside of the East Coast and the West Coast, you know, you go into what we call the flyover country, probably most of the people will not even know that there is something like Polish transformation after the end of communism and all of that. The image is really very stale. But even among the elite, I think, in the United States, there isn't a very good grasp, I think, of the speed of change. I agree with you. Poland has an opportunity to play a leadership role in the region. And as such, it can leverage that position in its relationship with the United States. I think Poland has a great role to play to the east. I share these views with Professor Malicki here. I think Poland is a natural conduit, translating, so to speak, what's happening in the east for the majority of the Europeans, but also for the Americans. Poland also has a very keen sense of its own history of insecurity. I always tell my friends in Washington that you have to stipulate the fact that Poland, only 20-some years ago, was not sovereign, it was an occupied country, it was a de facto colony of a neighboring state. And if you don't stipulate this into a conversation but dismiss it, you know, say these people are irrational, Russophobes, and blah, 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 you will not understand what goes on here and you will not be successful. And quite frankly, you're also being disrespectful and dismissive towards Poland. Because when I'm in Helsinki, and a 3-star general tells me that Finland doesn't want to join NATO because 70 years ago, Russia invaded it during the Winter War. And that's treated seriously. Yeah, I have the Finns, they fucking Russians. When the Poles bring up this argument, it doesn't mean that they're unreconstructed, I suppose. It's just that they have a keen sense of history. And they know how tenuous the balances can be. I have great hope for the younger generation. I don't want to get poetic here, but I just want to say one last thing here. Because I see a re-emergence of a kind of new form of patriotism that is modern in very many respects. I mean, these are young men and women who feel very comfortable in Europe, who are educated in a different way, who travel, who work in different places. But at the same time, I see them also acquiring a very quiet sense of national identity and pride. And why do I say it's important? Because despite the fact that every bureaucrat in the European Union tells me that the EU will be fine and everything will be fine, and ask yourself a question: what does a 20-year-old Greek and a 20-year-old German have in common today? If you look at their next 10, 15 years in terms of their life path, right? What are their experiences going to be like? I think that German will have a very nice apartment or house, have a family, raise kids, have a job. What are the prospects for that young Greek? What ties them together in a shared European identity? And my point is not that I'm anti-European, on the contrary. I think The European Union is the lottery ticket that Poland won. It's part of that. NATO, the European Union. This is all that's driving this country forward. What I'm trying to say, be ready for what's really happening in the European Union, which is the stresses are building up. The EU is already a very different institution than what it was only a few years ago before the crisis. And then you have a decision to make about how to adapt to this. I'm optimistic in my conversations with students and young people in Poland. I see a growing sense of a new elite emerging, and I use this word judiciously. And I hope that they are engaged in these larger questions of what constitutes a lasting national interest. There are countries, without naming them, where I travel, that in the parliament you get arguments over everything. When it comes to core national interests, the argument ends. I think Poland needs to get to that point where this is easily communicated to the public at large, because that will build up the consensus on the kind of security possible. I apologize for the preaching.
Thank you. Dear girls, it's ought to finish this part of our conference, inaugural ceremony, because in 4 minutes we shall start with panels. Thank you for questions. I would like to thank unfortunately we must start with panels. I would like to thank Professor Novak for his welcome speech, and I would like to thank Professor Andrzej for his inaugural lecture. Thank you. Let the conference begin.
No musi pani... Nie, to jest ten WEC. Tam jest hasło. WEC 2013.